Something people never tell you about the true empath who finally returns, but isn't the same. It's easy to mistake the change for newfound strength. The story we crave is one of triumph, a victory march back onto the same field, armor gleaming, will unbreakable. But the psyche doesn't travel that upward, linear road. It doesn't march, it descends. It spirals inward into long, sealed chambers and unlit depths. What emerges isn't a fortified ego, but an entirely new arrangement between the conscious mind and the vast inner unknown. And this subtle shift changes everything. You might see their calm, their non-reaction, their refusal to plead their case, and call it resilience. But that's a surface-level illusion. Resilience implies force of will, a muscular ego asserting dominance. What's happened is far more unnerving to the world that once fed on their openness. Something vital has retracted. Something essential has sealed its chamber and will not emerge again just to be witnessed, consumed, or deciphered. In my years of observation, long before labels like empath were common, I saw these individuals. They weren't weak. They were porous. Their unconscious minds sent out filaments, absorbing the emotional weather of everyone around them. They carried weights they never chose. They were praised for their depth, admired for their feeling, yet subtly used for those very traits. Their core issue wasn't a lack of strength, it was an excess of access. A psyche left undefended becomes public property. What you're seeing in their return isn't a reinforcement of that openness, but its ceremonial closing. This closure isn't bitterness or coldness in the usual sense. It is the soul executing an act of self-preservation after its fundamental laws were violated for too long. The unconscious, when its signals are ignored for years, doesn't debate. It rescinds its offerings. Here's a difficult truth. Their disappearance isn't about the wound. It's about finally listening. In a dream, a moment of silent collapse, or a body's symptom that could no longer be reasoned away, the deep self spoke with ultimate clarity. It said, in a language of symbols, "This way leads to dissolution." And when that voice speaks with such authority, the conscious self must heed it or risk being dismantled. Often this turning point is marked by dreams. They might dream of vaults with sealed doors, of estates left empty, of woods where no path is permitted to follow. They may dream of watching from behind thick glass as hands beat against it, or they dream of wild creatures, foxes, hawks, bears, beings that exist without permission, bound by instinct, not social contract. These dreams aren't random stories. They are corrective visions from a psyche that adapted too completely to the needs of others. You see, boundless empathy isn't a virtue, it's a systemic flaw. A psyche, like a body, needs a membrane to stay intact. Without skin, the organism bleeds out. Without a psychic boundary, the soul diffuses into the expectations, projections, and hungers of those around it. The empath who endlessly explains is not communicating, they are hemorrhaging meaning. And here, we must confront the shadow, because this transformation cannot happen without it. The empath's shadow is often mislabeled as anger. That's shallow. The true shadow is far more threatening to their old identity. It's the power to decline without excuse, to recede without apology, to hold silence without guilt. In such a psyche, quiet isn't emptiness. It's a declaration of sovereignty. When they stop being so accessible, people around them often perceive it as cruelty, arrogance, or abandonment. But that reaction says more about the observers. What's been lost isn't connection, it's unrestricted entry. And access, when it's confused with intimacy, provokes outrage when revoked. This is why they don't come back stronger. Strength would mean entering the same arena with better weapons. What's happened is a refusal to enter at all. The arena itself has been seen for what it is, a place where the soul cannot stay whole. This realization isn't heroic. It's somber, clear-eyed, and deeply adult. In the symbolic language of transformation, this phase isn't the radiant dawn or the triumphant return. It's the long, necessary night that teaches the psyche the price of unconscious engagement. They have been scorched not by external fire, but by the slow, internal heat of chronic self-relinquishment. And from that scorching arises not power, but discernment. Discernment is quieter than strength. It doesn't proclaim itself. It needs no audience. It simply knows where life can move and where it must not. The empath who is no longer on call hasn't become less loving. They have become precise. Love without a gatekeeper becomes a sacrifice demanded by others. Love that is guarded becomes a sacred offering. Listen to them now. You'll notice something uncanny. They no longer debate their own nature. They've stopped trying to make you understand. This isn't because they found the perfect argument. It's because the need to translate their inner world has vanished. Translation is only necessary when you're in foreign territory. They have, psychologically, come home. And home isn't about comfort. It's about alignment. It's the moment the ego stops bargaining with forces that do not honor its dignity. Their withdrawal isn't an act against others. It's an act for the self. And the self is not a bigger ego. It's the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, knit together by a principle older than social rules. Those who meet them after this shift often feel a strange distance. They're the same, they'll say, but something's gone. What's gone is the unconscious invitation to intrude. The doorway isn't ajar. The light is on, but the home is not for lease. This change is permanent. You cannot relearn naive innocence. Once the psyche has tasted the cost of its own permeability, it cannot go back to that naivete without becoming ill. Any forced attempt to be that available again leads to despair, panic, or physical sickness. The body itself will revolt against the old pattern. You must understand this is individuation, not empowerment. Empowerment is for slogans. Individuation belongs to destiny. It isn't chosen because it feels good. It's chosen because the other option is psychic death. They have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. They have learned that not every summons deserves a reply, and not every suffering person holds a key to their inner world. So when you meet such a person, don't ask how they got stronger. Ask instead what they had to surrender to become complete. Ask what illusions were let go, what former identities were laid to rest, what relationships could not withstand the introduction of a boundary. Ask what inner whisper finally grew loud enough to be obeyed. Because what returns is not the empath you knew. What returns is a psyche that has recalled its true center. When such a psyche moves in the world again, It does so without announcements or lengthy justifications, because explanation itself has become questionable. Explanation is a habit of the ego, a bridge built for those who can't bear uncertainty. But the individuated psyche has learned to dwell with ambiguity as one dwells with the dusk, not as a foe, but as a requirement for depth. So the empath who is no longer on call doesn't declare their absence. They simply cease to appear where they were once expected to stand. This is deeply destabilizing to those who depended, knowingly or not, on their former porousness. Many bonds, though cloaked in the language of closeness, are actually held up by imbalance. One feels profoundly, the other feels securely. One listens without end, the other speaks without limit. One adapts, the other sets the terms. When the empath withdraws, that imbalance topples, and with it falls the illusion that the relationship was mutual. What's left is often anger, bewilderment, or moral condemnation. The psyche that has individuated is often called selfish by those who profited from its selflessness. But selfishness, rightly understood, is not the same as selfhood. The self is not a moral idea. It is a regulating core. When the ego aligns with that core, behavior shifts not from ethical defiance, but from inner imperative. The empath doesn't say, "I will not give." They discover, often with grief, that giving has become impossible without internal ruin. This discovery isn't chosen, it's unveiled. In many cases, the unveiling comes through an exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, or through recurring dreams of being chased, depleted, or endlessly called upon. I remember people who dreamed of bottomless pits, of unappeasable mouths, of hands that take without thanks. These aren't conscious metaphors. They spring from the unconscious as a symbolic diagnosis. The psyche states, "This pattern must end." And when it ends, something interesting occurs. The empath's emotional intensity often lessens. This is frequently misread as detachment. But what has diminished isn't feeling itself. It's the compulsion to react. Feeling without compulsion is a different creature entirely. It is still profound and far less obvious. They still feel, but they no longer feel accountable for the emotional balance of everyone else. This distinction is vital. Responsibility, when stretched beyond its rightful limits, becomes a form of possession. The empath was once possessed by the pain of others, by their expectations, by their unspoken requests. Possession is always a loss of liberty, even when it wears the mask of goodness. The withdrawal of availability is therefore a reclaiming, not a retreat. Something foreign has been released. Here, the mythic dimension becomes clear. Their change often echoes the ancient pattern of the wounded healer who must leave the town to stay alive. The archetype itself could cure others, but not itself. Yet even that healer did not heal forever. His wound became a site of wisdom, not an altar for endless sacrifice. The empath who remains available past their psychic limits doesn't become a healer. They become a casualty, sanctified by routine. What you're seeing in this altered return is the emergence of the sage archetype, not as isolation, but as keen judgment. The sage doesn't despise the community. He just knows when to step back from it. He turns his illumination inward, not outward. And this inward turn is often mistaken for pride or contempt. But it's neither. It's loyalty to an inner law. There is often mourning in this stage, though it's rarely shown. They grieve the loss of an identity that once provided meaning. The role of the one who comprehends, who contains, who soaks up. To release that role is to release a certain moral simplicity. You no longer know yourself as the good one versus the selfish ones. Instead, you enter a morally gray space where the question is no longer who deserves aid, but what the psyche can bear without breaking. This ambiguity is unbearable to the collective, which prefers clear roles and predictable behavior. Their withdrawal disrupts these scripts. It introduces doubt, and doubt is one of the great anxieties of the unconscious mind. Those who demand explanations from the withdrawn empath aren't seeking truth. They're seeking the return of predictability. But predictability is the adversary of individuation. The self does not repeat itself to stay comprehensible. It unfolds from an inner necessity that often clashes with outside expectations. This is why the journey is so often lonely. Not because the person rejects others, but because others reject the loss of the familiar pattern. You may see that the empath who is no longer available becomes eerily unmoved in conflict. Words that once cut deep now pass by. Accusations that once induced shame now land without effect. This isn't numbness. It's the dissolution of the inner knot that once bound them to reaction. Where there is no inner knot, there is no hook. Where there is no hook, manipulation falters. This is perhaps the most threatening part of the change. A person who cannot be provoked cannot be controlled. A person who does not explain cannot be redefined. A person who no longer craves to be understood has exited the psychological marketplace of approval altogether. Such a person is not stronger. They are more free. Yet freedom, in the true sense, isn't always pleasant. It carries duty without comfort. They can no longer blame others for their depletion, because they now see their former availability as a collaboration in their own fading. This realization is humbling. It dismantles the comforting story of pure victimhood. One must admit, painfully, that one's suffering was not only inflicted but also allowed. This admission, if integrated, doesn't breed bitterness. It produces clarity, and clarity is the true signature of psychological maturity. The clear psyche doesn't dramatize its limits. It simply inhabits them. If you listen to their speech, you'll hear fewer qualifiers and more pauses. Silence grows more common, not as a strategy, but as a native state. Silence, when it rises naturally, means the psyche is no longer shattered by the need to answer. It is whole enough to be quiet. This is why those who meet the changed empath often feel an inexplicable loss. They might say, "I don't know why, but I feel like I can't get through anymore." And they are right. What they can't reach is the old opening they once walked through. That opening has sealed over. Healing, contrary to popular belief, doesn't always restore what was. Sometimes it removes what should never have been accessible to begin with. The scar isn't a flaw. It's a border drawn by lived experience. And so they come back changed, not as a figure of conquest, but as a figure of quiet. No. They refuse to be the place where others discard what they don't wish to carry. They refuse to be the mirror where others view their anguish without accountability. They refuse to be endlessly decipherable. This refusal isn't aggression. It's alignment with the self. And the self, once claimed, does not negotiate its presence. When this transformation touches the realm of love, the effects are often misread, sometimes painfully so. Love, in its immature form, thrives on constant access. It feeds on emotional immediacy, on the promise that the other will always be there to receive, to calm, to clarify, to adjust. But love, when it meets individuation, must either grow or fall apart. The empath who is no longer on call does not love less. They love in a new way. And this new way is often intolerable to those whose idea of love rested on unconscious privilege. What vanishes first is the old rhythm. There's no longer the same instant response, the same urgency to fix, the same instinct to fill every silence. They have learned, usually through pain, that not every rift is theirs to close. This learning isn't cheap. It's purchased with disillusion. You must let go of the fantasy that love alone can redeem dysfunction. You must accept that love without edges becomes a kind of self-erasure. In dreams, this shift is often shown by changing figures. Where once they dreamed of children needing protection, animals needing rescue, or wounded souls calling out, they may now dream of peers, of strangers who maintain space, or of solo travels. The psyche is recalibrating its image of relationship. It no longer casts itself as the essential center. It steps to the side. This stepping aside is often mistaken for emotional retreat. Yet it's better seen as emotional independence. Independence doesn't erase connection. It refines it. Only when you are no longer needed in a compulsive way can you truly choose to be present. They have discovered the difference between being chosen and being used. And once you know that difference, you cannot unknow it. You'll notice they become unusually careful with intimacy. They don't open swiftly. They don't reveal fully. They watch. They listen. They allow time. This isn't cunning. It's self-regard, earned the hard way. The psyche has learned that exposure without a container leads to splintering. So it protects itself not from fear, but from loyalty to its own profundity. There's often a temptation here to glamorize the change, to call it enlightenment. That too is a defense. The reality is more sober. They carry sorrow alongside their new boundaries. They mourn the simplicity with which they once loved. They mourn the belief that understanding would always be returned. They mourn the bonds that couldn't withstand the introduction of limits. This sorrow doesn't explode. It settles like fine dust in a deep well. It informs the psyche without ruling it. They learn to hold loss without endlessly talking about it. This ability to endure without exhibition is another mark of integration. Pain no longer insists on a spectator. Here, we must speak of the shadow again. For the shadow doesn't disappear when boundaries form. It morphs. The old shadow of suppressed fury may give way to a subtler peril, a sense of superiority. Having seen the cost of over-giving, they may be tempted to view others as unconscious, exploitative, or lesser. This temptation must be faced squarely. Individuation doesn't mean rising above others. It means differentiating from unconscious cycles. If this confrontation is avoided, the psyche risks calcifying. Boundaries become barricades, discernment becomes disdain, silence becomes isolation, not from inner truth, but from dread of being vulnerable. This isn't the transformation we're discussing. True individuation keeps permeability without surrender. It allows contact without crumbling. It says yes where the psyche can stay whole and no where it cannot. The difference is delicate but absolute. You can feel it in the body. The integrated empath feels grounded, not tense when they say no. There's no internal debate, no delayed regret. The body concurs. This physical agreement is a clear sign the boundary comes from the self, not a defensive ego. Now we must address the inevitable question from outside observers. Why didn't you tell me? As if an explanation could have stopped the transformation, as if awareness alone could have changed the necessity. But individuation doesn't happen because others misunderstand. It happens because the psyche can no longer live in its old shape. No amount of talk can bargain with that fact. Explanation at this point would be a step backward. It would put them back in the role of translator, mediator, emotional keeper. The refusal to explain, therefore, isn't punishment, it's preservation. The psyche has learned some truths cannot be shared without being weakened, twisted, or turned against the speaker. This is why they often become strangely opaque. They answer briefly. They don't elaborate. They don't correct misreadings. This opacity isn't hostility. It's a refusal to hand over the authority to interpret. The psyche reclaims the right to stay partly unknown. The collective finds this deeply uneasy. We're taught that openness equals goodness, transparency equals trust, but the unconscious knows better. It knows mystery isn't deception. Mystery is the natural condition of anything alive. Only what is finished is fully known. In old traditions, the initiate was marked not by what they revealed, but by what they would no longer disclose. Silence wasn't secrecy. It was sanctification. Something had been set apart. Their withdrawal into selective presence echoes this ancient motif. It's a modern expression of an old psychological truth. As this process solidifies, their future orientation shifts. They no longer seek meaning by being needed. They no longer structure their life around emotional demand. Instead, they start to listen for what wants to arise from within. This is often a directionless phase. Without the familiar part of caretaker, the ego may feel vacant. If I am not this for others, it asks, who am I? This question can't be answered quickly. It must be lived through. The psyche experiments. Long neglected interests return. Creativity comes back not as service, but as authentic expression. Solitude becomes rich, not lonely. They learn to be alone without feeling deserted. This is a fundamental shift. To be alone without feeling abandoned is to be accompanied from within. It's at this stage that the self begins to show its course, not through loud proclamations, but through soft leanings, a draw towards certain kinds of work, certain people, certain life rhythms. These pulls aren't urgent. They don't demand instant action. They invite patience. They have learned to wait, not for others, but for inner cohesion. So, paradoxically, the empath who is no longer on call becomes capable of deeper relationship than before. But these relationships are fewer. They aren't based on rescue or merging. They're based on mutual recognition. Two psyches meet not to complete each other, but to witness each other. Such bonds can't be forced. They emerge slowly, often unexpectedly, and they don't tolerate performance. This is why their return feels so final to those who knew them before. Something essential has transferred its loyalty. The psyche no longer belongs to the collective dream of endless giving. It belongs to itself. And yet, this isn't an end. It's a reorientation. They haven't withdrawn from life. They've withdrawn from misuse. They haven't closed their heart. They've closed the gates around it. What remains is a quiet, enduring presence, not stronger in the way the world applauds, but more authentic, more defined, more aligned. Over time, something quietly remarkable starts to happen around them. Without intent, without teaching, they become a disruption in the psychic environment of others. This disruption isn't loud. It's sensed, not intellectualized. People feel the old patterns no longer work. Appeals that once succeeded now fail. Emotional pressure finds no resonance. Familiar tactics lose their hold. And in that failure, others are forced, perhaps for the first time, to confront themselves. This is one of the least spoken truths of deep change. Individuation in one person unsettles unconsciousness in others. They don't aim to provoke change, but change is provoked anyway. Because the relational field has been transformed. Where there was once absorption, there is now reflection. Where there was once rescue, there is now a certain absence. And absence, when it appears in the right place, becomes a mirror. Many will not tolerate this mirror. They'll interpret the withdrawal as betrayal, arrogance, or moral failure. They'll tell tales of coldness and cruelty, because such tales preserve their own unconscious position. To admit the truth would require a painful acknowledgement that they relied on another's self-erasure to maintain their own balance. Not everyone is ready for that admission, but some will feel something else. They'll feel exposed, not attacked, but revealed in the presence of someone who no longer functions emotionally. Their own shortfalls become visible. They must carry their own feelings. They must speak their own needs clearly. They must face the discomfort of not being the center of another's inner world. This confrontation is deeply unsettling, but it's also potentially transformative. In this way, they become a silent initiator, not by preaching, but by embodying a different way. They demonstrate, simply by existing differently, that you can survive without constant explanation, without endless adjustment, without being consumed by the emotional tides of others. This demonstration is far more potent than any lecture. And yet, this role is solitary. Don't romanticize it. They often stand between worlds, no longer fully part of the old patterns, not yet surrounded by others who've undergone a similar journey. This in-between state can feel eerily hollow. Old ties loosen, new ones aren't yet formed. The psyche must endure a period of relative solitude without falling into nostalgia or bitterness. Here again, the unconscious offers guidance, often through symbols of thresholds. Dreams of bridges, archways, crossings become common. They may dream of standing at a shore's edge or walking alone through unknown terrain. These images aren't warnings. They're confirmations. The psyche is noting a passage that can't be hurried. One must also understand the old hunger to be seen and affirmed doesn't vanish overnight. It returns at unexpected moments, sometimes with great force. The difference now is they recognize this hunger as an inner movement, not an external command. It's felt, acknowledged, and contained, not immediately acted out through over-giving or self-justification. This containment is a sign of maturity. The psyche has learned to hold tension without dissolving it. Holding tension is one of the highest psychological accomplishments. It lets opposites coexist without premature resolution. They can now feel compassion without compulsion, connection without fusion, desire without surrender. This capacity was impossible before because the inner foundation needed to support it hadn't yet been built. Their former availability wasn't generosity, it was structural weakness. As this inner structure consolidates, something else changes. Time itself feels different. They no longer live in constant anticipation of reaction or repair. There's more space between stimulus and action. In that space, reflection is born. And reflection, unlike reaction, belongs to consciousness. This new relationship with time often surprises them. They're no longer in a rush to resolve emotional ambiguity. They can let questions hang. They can allow misunderstandings without rushing to correct them. This patience isn't apathy. It's trust in the psyche's ability to regulate itself without outside validation. At this stage, the old fear of being too much or not enough starts to dissolve. These fears belong to a psyche that measured itself through others' responses. When availability is withdrawn, that measuring stick vanishes. They no longer know themselves through reflection alone. They begin to know themselves directly, through inner harmony rather than external feedback. This shift has profound effects on identity. They are no longer primarily the one who understands or the one who feels for others. These labels may still fit, but they are no longer central. Identity reorganizes around being rather than doing, and this reorganization feels, at first, strangely empty. Roles are comforting. Being is vast. Vastness can be frightening. It lacks edges. It doesn't tell you who to be next. They must learn to tolerate this openness without hastily filling it with new roles or causes. Many fail here, rushing to replace old patterns with new identities that look different but serve the same compensatory function. True individuation resists this temptation. It lets the void remain until something authentic emerges. What emerges eventually is a quieter sense of purpose. Not a mission driven by suffering, but a direction shaped by inner resonance. They begin to sense what nourishes rather than drains. They move toward environments where reciprocity exists naturally, not through negotiation. They recognize, often instantly, situations where old patterns would be triggered, and they decline them without drama. Declining without drama is perhaps the clearest sign a significant cycle of transformation is complete. There's no need to justify, explain, or defend the refusal. The refusal simply is. And because it isn't charged with resentment, it doesn't invite escalation. It shuts the door gently but finally. You'll notice their language changes too. Fewer emotional modifiers, fewer attempts to soften statements to avoid discomfort. Speech becomes simpler, more direct, less performative. This simplicity isn't bluntness. It's alignment between inner experience and outer expression. When there's less inner conflict, there's less need for elaborate phrasing. In the presence of such simplicity, others often feel strangely unsettled. They can't find the usual handles. There's nothing to negotiate, nothing to fix, nothing to tug on. And in that absence of hooks, they must face themselves. Some will turn away, others will grow. It's important to emphasize they don't become invulnerable. They still feel pain. They still know loss. But suffering no longer organizes their identity. Pain is allowed to pass through, not to define. This is a subtle but decisive shift. They no longer unconsciously prove their worth through endurance. This is why the change looks, from the outside, like a disappearance. They're no longer everywhere, endlessly reachable, immediately responsive. But disappearance isn't evaporation, it's condensation. Energy once dispersed has gathered, and gathered energy has weight. Presence deepens. When they do appear, it matters more. Words carry more force because they aren't diluted by overuse. Attention becomes a gift, not a reflex. Those who are received feel it immediately. Those who are not don't get an explanation. This isn't cruelty. It's economy. The psyche has learned to allocate its resources according to inner truth, not external demand. This learning is irreversible. And so we arrive at a quiet conclusion that doesn't feel like an ending. They don't come back stronger. Strength belongs to the mythology of conquest. What has emerged is something older and more durable: sovereignty. The psyche governs itself. It no longer yields to unconscious expectation. They haven't hardened, they've clarified. They haven't withdrawn from love, they've withdrawn from misuse. They haven't become unavailable to life. They've become unavailable to patterns that required their self-erasure. What returns then isn't the old figure reshaped, but a different center altogether. A psyche that knows where it begins and ends. A heart that stays open, but is no longer unguarded. A presence that doesn't ask to be understood. And this, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. Their transformation doesn't need permission. It doesn't require agreement. It doesn't wait for closure. It happens because the self has decided survival now depends on wholeness. Those who can meet this wholeness will recognize it without explanation. Those who cannot will feel the loss and call it something else. They do not correct them. And that silence isn't absence. It is arrival. If this exploration resonated with you, I invite you to like this video. It helps support this channel, Winds of Thought, as we continue mapping these inner landscapes. I'll see you in the next one.